Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Low Society. We have a guest for you guys today. We are here with Ashley Frawley. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ashley? Let us know a little bit about you.
Sure thing. So as you said, I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University. I'm the program director of the BSc Sociology program there. So I run a sociology program, and so I have my finger on the pulse, I like to think, of social issues because, I write and I teach about it every day. So that's kind of who I am. I'm the author of Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, and a new book called Significant Emotions, which isn't out yet because I have not finished it. I do not recommend that you sign a book contract and then have 2 children.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I've definitely seen you around quite a bit. I first discovered you through Zero Books and some of the stuff that you've done there. And I also saw you on UK TV quite a bit. I saw you on The Big Questions, which is like one of my least favorite shows, but it was so refreshing to see you on there just kind of cut through all of the culture war discourse. How was that? How was the experience of being on that show?
Yeah, it's funny because that's one of my least favorite shows to do. It's horrible. It's so bad. You have no time at all to say anything. And there's no nuance or anything like that. And you really the first time I went on that show, I didn't really get the format. And so I was like, oh, they're not going to let me talk. So I was just busting in and quoting Karl Marx and stuff.
I was like, yes, queen, yes, queen. That was the first yes, queen that show has ever gotten from me, because it is really sort of largely rooted around culture war in this very kind of weird, specifically English way. But speaking of the UK, I know that you live here, you work in the UK. The COVID situation here, I was just actually watching the news just this morning with my mom, and it seems as if the country is kind of falling apart under the weight of this whole epidemic. I mean, would you like to talk a little bit about what your opinions are, what you're observing, what you're noticing?
Yeah, it's I always say commenting on social issues in the way that I do, I've kind of fallen into that, where I feel like when somebody in the media gets your name, you become part of the 5 people who are always in the UK media. I don't know why, people will just pass around your contact details, and then the next thing you know, you're on TV all the time because it's oh, we need a sociologist. Well, we'll just pick her because we know that she exists. But it's actually something that I feel very uncomfortable doing. I have to come up with an opinion or a take or whatever very quickly. It's really antithetical to kind of who I am, because I take actually a long time to think about things and think about my opinion on something. And I really my books and my research are all about me methodically reading and piecing together some story or some issue or some problem, and then through coming to understand what it is and simply just describing what it is in a lot of ways, I come to have an opinion or to challenge it, but challenge it in a way by showing what it is. And that's extremely time consuming. Yeah. So with COVID, I found it very hard. And in fact, I stopped writing. I was writing for Unheard, weekly articles, and then it was just all COVID. And I stopped actually contributing because I didn't know what I thought. It was such a weird situation, and everybody had a take. And I just felt I just want to be quiet and kind of think about this for a bit. And it is very, very difficult because there's so much misinformation, and there's a lot of distrust, and so conspiracy theories kind of got out of hand. And in spite of myself, I can become quite conspiratorial. So my initial
come to the right podcast.
Yes, you come to the right podcast.
But I do try to keep that to myself because I know that that's a weakness that I have, and so I will but because I like to think of myself as fairly open-minded, I do actually consider even crazy ideas because they're interesting, right? And then I kind of think, I think them through to their logical conclusions, and I kind of let them go. So with COVID, I found it very difficult. But at this point, My answer is just the simplest thing. My appraisal is just the simplest appraisal that, at least in the UK, what should have happened is pretty much the opposite of what did happen. We knew the epidemiological profile of the coronavirus right from the very beginning, and it was very, very clear that it is not an equal opportunity killer. There is, it has always been clear who was most at risk. And yet there was this push to kind of democratize the risk. And to every time like a young person died, it was all over the news. And yet you had people saying like, oh, you're a granny killer if you like broke lockdown rules. But obviously as a society, we didn't care that much about older people because it wasn't enough. We couldn't like marshal think of all the resources that went into the furlough scheme, for example. Could we not have marshaled those resources to protect the most vulnerable in society? Absolutely. Nobody was on board for that. It had to be something that affected everyone and everyone equally, or apparently we just didn't care. So I think, unfortunately, what wound up happening was rather than protecting those most vulnerable in society, we literally shipped sick people to care homes. I just think that was madness. And I think that's down to a lot of the ways that our society struggles to understand risk and deal with risk. We see this all the time. And in fact, we have a sociological concept for it, the democratization of risk, where risk usually is quite specific and undemocratic. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to deal with risks if it was just random, right? Crime, people like... my main area of research is social problems. And you always get, like, if you teach like a criminology class, you'll always get an essay that says like, crime can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. And you're like, no, I just spent the whole semester telling you that crime is patterned. Yeah. So there are patterns to these sorts of things, and yet we feel very comfortable talking about risk as though it's random. And unfortunately, that means that we have a lot of difficulty dealing with risks, even when they're quite clearly not random.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. And I mean, one of the things that is causing a huge wave of anxiety right now in the UK is the inevitable economic fallout from the crisis as well. We're looking down the barrel of a major recession. And of course, that's a risk that's going to affect, obviously, the most vulnerable members of our society. And it's definitely exposed a lot of contradictions in terms of how our economy is structured. However, I've noticed that a lot of people politically at the moment in terms of the climate seem to be doubling down on the status quo, regardless of how much reality kind of hits them in the face. It's either they veer off into conspiratorial thinking. I know that there was the huge anti-lockdown protest that happened with David Icke in Trafalgar Square not too long ago. So it's either they kind of veer off into like galaxy brain conspiratorial thinking, or they're just sort of doubling down on, stiff upper lip, we've got to get on with it type of thinking. What do you think is the cause of that phenomenon? And if so, what do you think would be the thing that would get people kind of waking up to the realities of the issues that we're facing in terms of how our economic system is structured?
Well, in terms of the economy, I think that COVID in many ways was like manna from heaven. We were headed for a recession anyway. And it's funny because I actually said to my students in January, I said, we're headed for a recession, we're due for one. Most of the indicators show that we are on our way to one. They happen about, fairly regularly, and we didn't... we just solved the last recession with the same problems that caused it. Just everybody's clamoring for a new bubble. There isn't any very much incentive to actually be productive and to create things. And so we have the same kind of issues going forward. And I said this in January. I said, I don't know what the catalyst will be. And my other thing that I said was that the universities, there's a massive bubble in universities at the moment. And unfortunately, I'm in the center of that bubble. So I said, you guys will be fine. It's me. I'm on the chopping block. So I am currently in the inside of a university. And I can see that it is, I don't know if other people know. It's not really been in the media, but the university system is collapsing, I think, in the UK. But anyway, so we were headed for a recession anyway, and COVID makes it seem as though it's an external shock. So otherwise, capitalism would trundle along. It would just be fine. yeah, okay, there are problems, but this thing came along, and and that's what's going to cause this recession. And it's wonderful ideologically, because when workers are asked to take the fallout, it'll be, well, a sacrifice to save lives, and what was the alternative? And in fact, we should have done it harder. We should have really screwed the economy. I mean, in terms of the left, we were really stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Like, you wanted to save lives. You don't want to make people destitute. And you're kind of like, what do you kind of say? What do you advocate? And so you had people kind of, swinging from one side to the other, and they were not really a coherent position. And I think part of that is because of the fact that really the left has lost a lot of our economic base, our sort of shared understanding of why there are economic problems. And part of my whole quest really is to politicize economics, that I think that politics ought to be mostly about economics, not culture wars. Yes. But when the left let go of economics, we pretty much damned ourselves to fighting a never-ending culture war. Yeah. And so again, COVID became a bit of a culture war as well.
It's so true.
Yeah, which masked the economic base, the problems of the economic base, which preceded coronavirus.
I almost wonder if you might have thoughts on the phenomenon of what they're calling Zoom fatigue, because they're trying to play this thing off as though it's some sort of it's kind of a thing where you're doing the same thing too much. You're looking at a screen. You're performing actions without so much. I mean, it's something that came out of COVID, so it's somewhat related here, obviously. But I'd be interested to hear what you had to say about that. Yeah,
you have this tendency to study to death every tiny little minute discomfort, which, adding up in life is terrible. Like, yeah, I think I get fatigued being on Zoom. It's weird. Trying to lecture to people and not being able to see their faces is hard. But I would see this as part of a broader issue of alienation, or any kind of bigger issue of being alienated from agency or the economic base of society, or having any say over that, having any control over your working day, feeling like totally powerless. But you can break that up into all sorts of teensy tiny little things. Eye fatigue, the little twitch that you get, and I can just imagine people studying slaves. Like, thank God we didn't have this enormous bureaucracy and like research engine, 300-400 years ago, because I can well imagine that people be like, I mean, look at slaves. You can see the minutiae of the way that their arms move. And we did this study and we found that they are, this slave is 70% smaller than this slave, and then be like,
30% more likely to have
and they suffer from terrible mental health problems. And I would say, yeah, well, that's slavery. It's not fun, and that's all the different parts of being a slave, is like the fact that you feel hopeless, and you can call that a health problem. But I would call that the economic problem of feudalism. And when I call it that, then we have to do something about the economic problem of feudalism. Yeah. When you break it down into a million different little health problems, well, how you define a problem invites a particular solution. So bring on a host of experts and occupational therapists to give the odd, perhaps whipping should be reduced by 20%. I could well imagine that, but these are all parts of what is a much bigger issue, and that is the issue of what it's like to be like the Pajamatariat during COVID, but also part of the larger issue of just not having any agency generally.
I like that term, Pajamatariat. I think I'm going to steal that. That's brilliant. Well, on that, welcome to Low Society, our listeners. Thank you guys for listening. If you are on iTunes, be sure to leave 5 stars. Do all the things that help out the podcast. Chuck us $5 on Patreon. You get access to your bonus episodes there. Thank you so much for listening, and we shall continue. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about that I find really interesting when I've heard you talk is this idea of mental health ontology or therapy culture, and specifically how that manifests on the left in terms of left discourse. I know that you just sort of mentioned that we are, the left, quote unquote, has sort of surrendered broad kind of economic politics for culture war. And I definitely see this sort of hijacking of therapy lexicon as a tool in that regard. It's sort of a tool of obfuscation. Would you like to talk a little bit more about how you've seen this phenomenon manifest specifically on the left?
Oh, there's probably too much to describe, really. I think, I mean, I wrote an article about this for a magazine called Culture on the Offensive, where I kind of laid out more or less what I just said now, that, we've lost the economic basis of leftist movements. And when we did that, leftist politics came to be associated more with romantic anti-capitalism. So I wrote in this article that what happened when leftists lost that economic basis for our understanding of capitalism, and also which leads us to where we want to go. Your understanding of the present leads to your understanding of the future, right? If you want to control the future, you need to understand the present. And what happened when we lost that is that we sort of reverted to these romantic critiques. And so we have we no longer are interested in the working class. There's a lot of movements on the left that are really uncertain about the working class and are more interested in the peasantry of the world, which is a very sort of romantic kind of trope. So like the poor of the developing world, which, obviously there's a whole side of the left that's interested in these kinds of movements, but in the absence of the working class, this clear understanding of the working class, that came up. But one of these, in addition to these romantic critiques, anti-consumerism and that kind of thing, were psychological critiques. So psychological critiques of capitalism sort of came up to fill that void that used to be filled by a strong economic understanding. And so you get arguments like, well, capitalism is bad because it makes us unhappy, and capitalism is bad because it causes depression or mental health problems. What this misses is one of the most important insights of, I think, Marxism, which is that the human subject is open, that we are not determined, we are determining. Our human nature is not something that's contained within each and every individual. Or that pre-exists society. It's something that is created and recreated by engagement with the world. And what bothers me about some of these psychological critiques is that they have a very deterministic understanding of what it means to be human. So bad thing happens, you become damaged. Well, that ignores the fact that all around the world, people have very different understandings of themselves in relation to the bad things that happen to them, to the point where some people argue that PTSD is what we call a culture-bound syndrome. So it's something that Westerners in particular experience, but it's not something experienced by everybody around the world in response to disaster. And in fact, when disasters happen, there's some very good work by Vanessa Popovac and some other people who talk about how after disasters, the first thing that people want is they want to be reunited with loved ones, that kind of thing. And in some cases, they've been offered therapy before that happens. Wow. And there's just this assumption that of course you're going to be damaged. I remember a student sent me a clipping from somebody from I can't remember where it was. I want to say Ghana, but it was basically after something happened, they were all invited into this tent one by one to kind of talk to a psychologist. And they were like, this is so antithetical to everything that we do. And she says, where are the drum beats? Where are the dancing? Where's the dancing? I mean, that is how we come together as a community. After something bad happens, we reaffirm the foundations of our community. And to this idea of going one by one to talk about your problems to somebody, which is so different. So what it means to be human subjectivity, it changes when society changes, when the economic base of society changes. And you can see that all the time, all around the world. We are different. We have fundamentally different ideas in our heads because we have a different relationship with the world. I mean, think about, 1,000 years ago, the amount of knowledge that a person had in their head and what seemed natural and normal and inevitable. I mean, during feudalism, people would say, it is in the nature of the slave to be a slave. That's what they are in their nature. And you just couldn't imagine that a human being could be born into a particular sort sort of milieu and become something fundamentally different. It seemed as though it was contained within that individual. And then capitalism came and severed that tie to the land and severed that tie from, tradition and so on. And suddenly we were given, or we were thrown into a kind of freedom that had never really existed. As Oscar Wilde said, we were so free, indeed, we were free to starve. But we suddenly could become anything as long as a capitalist would pay for it.
Yeah.
And communism, I think, is a continuation of that, which is that you can become anything, even if a capitalist won't pay for it.
Exactly.
But this idea of open subjectivity, I think, is so fundamental to my understanding of Marxism and that part of the left. And to see it kind of sucked out through this very deterministic understanding, I find very, very difficult. Now, I can understand why people have done that. I mean, it works as a goad for social change. We find it very difficult to argue for freedom now, and instead we argue for health and safety. And that's an argument that maybe we can win. So I understand why that's happened, but I think it's important to think critically about that and to think about the implications of that loss. I don't think the main thing that's wrong with that, with capitalism is that it makes us unhappy, not the least because most people are fine.
That's so true. That's so true. And I mean, I've had to come viscerally in contact with this contradiction because of my background. Like, I am a third generation Nigerian. Yeah, but I'm a British citizen, but my great grandmother was among the first to sort of migrate to the UK. So I still have my roots pretty deeply within Nigerian culture. And I mean, even my mom has that kind of mindset and mentality around mental health, one that I don't, because I have my roots a lot further entrenched within Western culture. So when I think about mental health issues, I think about them in this very sort of atomized, go to the therapist kind of way. And I remember I was very kind of critical of my family members for not doing the same. But then I guess as I've gotten older, I've sort of started to notice that they have different ways of dealing with their issues, and it's definitely not atomized, it's communal, especially like things like the church play a huge role in terms of community support and mental health and all of those aspects that kind of institution like provided also played like a massive role for them. So yeah, there definitely are huge differences, and these sort of blanket statements about human nature appear attractive, obviously, because they're kind of, it's like a way of goading people in that regard, but I can definitely see how they would be problematic. I wonder what you think. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, they're also part of the justifying ideology of capitalism, right? Like, why are things the way they are? Well, it's just human nature. It's just human nature. That's, why doesn't capitalism work in this fabled equilibrium? Well, because human beings are weak and they mess it up. And so, yes, exactly, right? And to take that narrative onto the left and to see that as a critique of capitalism forgets that it was actually part of the justifying ideology for why things could never change, because human beings are weak. So to buy into that is a problem. But you mentioned about the church and that kind of thing. I do recognize that like the loss of the confessional, the loss of tradition and that sort of thing does create a kind of atomization. And this like I haven't had a friend that I see every day for like 10 years. My family lives on the other side of the ocean. I am atomized, and I do recognize that, the kinds of coping mechanisms that I would have had, 500 years ago don't exist. And so I recognize that there's a role there for therapeutics in the sense of providing that kind of confessional role. You have this like disinterested person you can go to and just like, blah. I get that there's a role for that. Where my issue arises is when those social ties that still do exist are actively undermined by an attempt to professionalize our relationships. So you get people saying things like, I don't want to do the emotional labor to deal with your problem. Like as though being another human being is something you ought to pay for, or when people will say things like, I've just been doing this research on mental health in universities. And one of the very first claims that was made, long before there was this whole idea of a crisis, was that students shouldn't rely on each other. In fact, they problematized the fact that when students have difficulties, they turn to each other and they turn to their families. They specifically said, no, don't do that. You don't have the training to deal with that. You have to go to, it was that, and you see this all the time with these movements. The very first claim that they make is that you don't have the ability to deal with this. This requires professional coping. And then people, the campaign is successful, and you have this uptick in people seeking professional help. You can see this when you study these discourses. They start with that: you must seek help. It doesn't matter. No problem is too small. You seek help, seek help, seek help. And then people do, and they go, wow, the problem of mental health is so huge now. Look at all these people seeking professional help. But you told us that we had to.
Yep.
You know, and you see this with all sorts of these movements. So I understand that there's a role for that. My issue comes when our relationships with each other are problematized and actively undermined by professionalization. I think is a problem.
It seems like it's a larger trend within human relations in general that, you know, the market is sort of stepping in and trying to commodify things that should just happen naturally. Like you see the same thing with the diversity industry, quote unquote, that have come in, that are going into workplaces and sort of, you know, trying to police and manage racial relations, you know, things that should just kind of happen within, you know, natural human relations have now become these professional industries that are massive money-making kind of centers, which kind of segues me into the next topic. I wonder how you think this sort of adoption of therapy lexicon and therapy culture has affected the domain of identity politics, which is something that, like, obviously we're incredibly critical of, but it's definitely something that I've noticed within the language that people who are kind of liberal left kind of identitarians use. I think one thing that springs to mind is, I don't know if you saw the DSA convention that happened last year or something. I'm sure you know what I'm
Too many people saw that.
Yeah,
too many people saw that.
Yeah. There's this sort of adoption of therapy lexicon and kind of the language of internal excavation, quote unquote, that's often used to obscure kind of general material interest. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, exactly what you said, basically, that what happened was, all the way back to the 70s, social movements discovered the language of victimhood, that if you could claim to be on the side of victims, you would be very successful in getting attention to your issue. And it works. The media has a very limited attention span. They have no interest. You know, people look at the media. They have very little interest in telling you to do anything except turn on the TV or buy a newspaper or buy a magazine or click. That's all they have interest in.
It's cyclical, yeah.
Yeah, and so all they want is, you know, something that's attention grabbing. And people who want to get their issues seen know that. And so it makes sense for them to frame their issues in very melodramatic terms: victims who suffer horribly and villains who are wholly evil. And so what winds up happening is that, yes, you get attention, but it actually supplanted any sense of what we're trying to get attention to. Victimhood became the end in itself. Getting the attention of people in terms of victimhood was all that was a movement could be about. And part of this is because with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the death of, any hope of socialism and communism and that sort of forward moving, this is it, right? Capitalism is the end of history. There is no alternative. Yeah. And so you had the fragmentation of social movements into all these little single issue campaigns, everybody competing against each other. And so it just became this like one-upmanship of who is the worst victim. And like, intersectionality came in and became basically the voice of this kind of one-upmanship of victimhood. And, it's a great way to get attention, but eventually it exhausts people. And people just say, just stop. Like, it is so far removed from the sort of much, much deeper issues that affect everyday life, which is, the economics, which is if you don't have any control over your life, any kind of agency, somebody whining about ever tinier forms of victimization is just so incredibly alienating. But that's what's happened, that we've just sort of damned ourselves to that because there's no unified movement anymore that has a coherent understanding of the movement of history, a coherent understanding of economics. And it's just a whole bunch of single issue people, grievances, essentially. I hate to use this word because I just had a falling out with Helen Pluckrose. But all of these sorts of grievances competing with each other that created this sort of upward spiral of victimhood. Now, obviously, there's a lot more going on than that, but that's part of what's happening, I think.
How do you think that do you think that the culture of therapy has had much to do with this? Because I think a lot of what I see has a lot to do with this sort of obsession with internal excavation and the idea of one's true real self in that regard, and how true freedom and liberation is this sort of internal kind of hero's journey into the depths of the unconscious to unearth, and I mean, obviously there's in that sense, that those sorts of things do have value, but when they obfuscate material reality, that's when I find things problematic. I'm a Marxist, but I also have a spiritual kind of side of me as well. I very much enjoy things like meditation. I think that they've added a lot of quality to my life and in terms of discipline and also self-knowledge and all of those great things. However, I don't see them as solutions to systemic problems. And I understand that it's an individual kind of thing, but I feel like there's an unhealthy obsession with self-excavation in that regard, that unless you find something that makes you a victim, or you find something that's weird about you, or you find something that's wrong, then you're not doing your job right. And it sort of turned all of the focus inward rather than out into the world. And it kind of reminds me of Edward Bernays. Oh, sorry, not Edward Bernays. What's his name? Freud's nephew. I forget his name.
That was Bernays.
Yeah. I can't remember his first name. Yeah, I
don't remember. Well, Bernays. It reminds me of Bernays.
No, it was Edward. It was Edward Bernays.
It was Edward Bernays.
That's
okay.
the correct name.
Okay, sorry. I was just making sure. Yeah, it sort of reminds me of Edward Bernays and the kind of culture that his machinations were responsible for creating, which was this idea of the individual as the prime subject of society, and the individual can sort of express their agency through consumption. And since therapy and mental health and wellness, quote unquote, are now consumables, the kinds of labels that people attach to themselves hold this sort of almost status to them in that regard. I wonder what you think about how this specific therapy culture and the push to this sort of obsessive external excavation has influenced identity politics.
I wish there was an obsessive external excavation. Internal excavation. Yeah, I know. No, I know. I got what you meant. I think there's in was it Chantal Delsalle's book? I haven't got it here. Anyways, Chantal Delsalle writes that throughout most of human history, most people didn't view themselves as an end in themselves. They viewed themselves as though they were signs. And if you know anything about semiotics, obviously a sign is a referent to something else, right? And so every individual was simply a referent to something else. You were a signifier of some signified that was beyond yourself. So in religion, all human beings were just signifiers of the divine, or in communism, we're just signifiers of some future project or some movement in history. And, you see that also in Viktor Frankl, where he says, you can't kind of focus on yourself. You have to have what gives life meaning is something beyond the self that you strive for. And that won't necessarily make you happy, but it will make suffering worthwhile. And paradoxically, if you have nothing beyond yourself, any kind of suffering becomes intolerable. Because what's happened is that the anchor for truth and meaning and purpose used to be beyond the self in some fabled future in God or something. And now that anchor is inside. It's in you. That anchor for truth is in you. It's in your health, your well-being, that sort of thing. And when that happens, you can no longer tolerate anything, because the purpose of your life is to reduce the intolerance of something, it's a quest for well-being or health. But of course that can never happen, because you will never ever attain a sense of well-being, because it by nature it is impermanent. Just by the nature of like time, you're not just going to sit here with a perfect feeling of well-being. You're going to need to go feed yourself. At some point you're going to get hungry, that sort of thing. And also you will never be able to, so health has become the paramount value in our society. It's become like a religion, which is why everybody goes a little bit crazy around health. We find it very difficult to make sense of, because it's not wholly, it is rational, but it's not like wholly empirical, I guess. It's more of like a higher value, like a religious value.
Well, the way the NHS is treated in the UK is almost like a sort of collective religious reality.
Oh my gosh, it is, absolutely. Protect the NHS, which is the most perfect, like, I always think about Marx's line, camera obscura. I always think about whenever things flip over. But it's the exact, like, well, I thought the NHS was there to protect me. But that's what happens, is that, like, health becomes a paramount value, and it becomes very difficult to think about anything beyond that. And therefore, any kind of sense of unhealthiness becomes intolerable. Paradoxically, we all become very, very unhealthy. We all become patients in waiting. So if you look at like surveys of people now versus sort of narratives of people that people put together 150 years ago, health was something that people had when they were not literally dying. So you had people with chronic illness, people with like, I remember this diary of this woman was talking about how she has uterine prolapse. And she's like, at least I have my health. And like, that's a very difficult thing to live with. But now if you do surveys of young people, they're far less likely to consider themselves as healthy, because like health has become something that must be actively pursued. And so you become like, I'm not healthy because I like eat too many chips or smoke, or, even though I may be healthy, like nothing wrong with me, I'm a patient in waiting. So what winds up happening when you have your meaning inside yourself, it becomes like an impossible, by definition, it becomes impossible to reach. And also, of course, we're all going to die. So like inevitably, health as a paramount virtue can only ever fail. So that's kind of what happens, is that anchor for truth has gone inside the self. And so everyone, how do we make sense of anything? How do we understand the truth of anything? You feel it in yourself. But it's only ever going to be contradictory and thwarted, because for human beings, our meaning has always been beyond the self. And that's just because of the nature of time as well. Like, it's always, the present is always disappearing into the future. And so to this idea of like living in the moment is impossible, but it's a wonderful industry. You sell people living in the moment, they're always going to want it because it's always fleeting.
Well, I did want to also, I don't want to pathologize people, obviously, since we're critiquing that form of language, but I do see this sort of culture as deeply psychologically unhealthy. And I wonder why people cling on to it. Even though it's quite clear that it's making them worse, or making them, at least, it's not even if it's not making them worse, it's not necessarily answering the questions that they're looking to have answered. And then I've also noticed that you get quite an angry response to some of these things, because people are attached to these notions, and they're also attached to the notion of the kind of caring professional that's like going to fix all of their problems. So why is it that you think people get so vitriolic towards your analysis of these things? And why do you think it's sort of a sacred cow?
What's interesting is that people used to get much angrier with me than they do now, which I think is good, because one area that I've been looking at now is understanding some of the particular forms that therapy culture takes in terms of fads. Obviously, there's therapeutic fads, there's self-esteem, happiness, well-being. But to try to understand what underlies these fads, and I always say it's this changing idea of what it means to be human. It's become very, very degraded. It's just like common sense that it's just, human nature to be weak and likely to fall ill. But then I started asking, well, why is that happening? Why is the human subject come to be conceptualized in such weak terms? And that's the sort of big question that I'm trying to answer now. But as I was critiquing these fads, I can always tell where we are in a fad cycle by how much pushback I get. So when I was writing my book on happiness, I got so much flack, tons and tons of flack. People were just like, why would you question this? Like, it's quite self-evidently something very good. You want people to be depressed? And then...
Yes, obviously. Yeah. What do you think?
And I had a lot of trouble explaining, like, well, when something rises like this, you have to ask, what is it deflecting attention from? Like, why do people in power embrace these sorts of things in the first place? It sounds very leftist, but you've got like David Cameron is the one espousing it. Something funny is going on. And I got a lot of pushback then, and people would have like little stars in their eyes, like this misty look, and they'd be like, we need this now. I remember people kind of, and then, the fad, I can tell that the fad is on its way out when people go, oh yeah, and there's no pushback. And yeah, exactly. And then they will also add their opinion on top of it. So they've been thinking about it. So the fad is over.
And they knew it the whole time, too.
Yes, exactly. So I know where we are in a fad when I get less pushback. Right now, we're in the heart, and I'm very, very careful about how I talk about things because I do get a lot of pushback around that. And I'm trying to get my head around exactly where mental health fits into this because it's not simply a fad. I wrote a paper about this and I called them therapeutic fad cycles. And then I realized it's not a cycle, it's a sublation. I don't know if you're familiar with like Hegel, this idea of like, it's not just a repetition, it's the coming together and the bringing of something to a higher level. So it's like the problem of the human subject at its fullest. So it becomes like, just like health became something that you constantly have to pursue, mental health has come to be something that you constantly have to pursue. And it sold itself as this like very positive thing, mental health promotion. But by doing that, if people's mental health is fine, then why do you have to promote it? Right. And I noticed that my students would start saying, they would say mental health when they clearly meant mental illness. So mental illness started to become this like mental health became a stand-in for what people really meant, which was mental illness. Which people don't even really use the word mental illness anymore. They say mental health, meaning... Well,
it's ableist to say mental illness now.
Yeah, but that's the thing is that...
It's so silly.
But that's the thing is that it becomes its opposite. You become defined by, and you get people saying like nobody really has mental health. It becomes something that must be constantly attended to, constantly pursued, and we are right in the middle of
commodity. If you think about it, it's an absolute like perfect consumer commodity because it's something you can never get, but they can continue to sort of market it.
Exactly, and so part of the question for me is, yes, it becomes a commodity, but also it becomes a purpose for people who are being attacked and undermined by capitalism, this sort of like educated kind of middle class who, we produce tons and tons and tons of psychology graduates, tons, who have limited professional qualifications in terms of being able to practice. And, over many, many years, I used to supervise a lot of their master's dissertations. And what really struck me was how many of them were about discovering some problem that you don't actually care about. But the real problem is that you don't care about it. And I am going to campaign to make you care about it because I've got the solution. And then that is exactly how the therapeutic industry works. They don't respond to problems. They create problems and then they sell you the solution. And that's what I've been describing in all of my research is the very first claims are never responding to a problem. They're always creating a deficit. They create the deficit that their thing is meant to solve or to fix.
And then meanwhile, you got all of the other things that are like, there's an actual like class oriented disparity or something like that, where people are just like, nah, whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But it also fixes that in a way, because it gives these people a purpose, right? They become part of this stratum of society that's like the social problems class. I put on Twitter, like, what do I call these people? The NGO class or something like that. This sort of educated middle class whose purpose is to attend to the problems of the working class. And you see this above, like, Indigenous communities as well. Like, people go, oh, there's all this money in Canada going to Indigenous people. You waste it. No, I'm saying all these horrible things about Indigenous people. But the money never goes to us. The money goes to, like, administering to the never-ending problem of the Indigenous subject. And there's just this enormous industry of people, like, getting grants and doing research to keep studying us. And this is the thing, that this whole, like, there's this whole economic stratum of people who have a purpose in attending to the problems of the poor. And so they make a purpose for themselves by creating problems and then selling their solutions. Right. And it's not just to working class people. I'm saying in fact, it's not even working class people who want this stuff. It's also like to middle class people. But that's, they get these lucrative government grants, and they work, they're part of the sort of therapeutic arm of the state and so on. So it is a commodity, but it also creates this, it fills that vacuum of people who are otherwise, who find themselves useless in the contemporary economy.
And I noticed the same sort of thing with the diversity industry and, the idea of implicit bias as well, and how that's sort of weaponized against the workforce in certain places. And I mean, obviously the workers are already a vulnerable class in and of themselves, and to this sort of thing. And there's obviously like a power imbalance as well between like the bosses and the workers. And it's incredibly pernicious the way that the professional managerial class kind of try to manage these issues and sort of bring in the kind of traditions associated with management into dealing with issues that we could just deal with as a society. I mean, I remember you saying, I don't remember if it was on Twitter or elsewhere, like, what did people, 300 years ago do when they had marriage problems or relationship problems? They weren't, going and paying a marriage counselor, $300 an hour. They were, talking to the people in their communities or seeking advice from people who were older than them, who had been married for much longer, or, any of those different sorts of things. And it does seem as if our first point of reference these days is to go straight to the professional rather
there's nothing, because we don't, I would go to a professional if I had marriage problems, because I don't have any friends. I don't have anybody.
Well, I mean, that's the problem right there, isn't it?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying, is that I do recognize that some of this does fill that space that was once occupied by more informal relationships. My problem is when they actively undermine those relationships. They say, you can't. These people are not qualified to do that. So then what makes us human becomes a commodity, becomes professionalized. And we feel that we're all mean and horrible to each other because we think that it's the job of somebody else to listen to you and be nice.
It's true.
But I think also the other problem is, so they undermine, sort of actively undermining informal relationships. That's when it becomes an issue. But also when it comes to the professional managerial class, when it comes to this diversity industry and so on, as you were mentioning, the main claim that they trade on is the problem is you. Now, they may pay lip service to bigger structural issues, and they will even use words like institutional racism. But what they mean by that is lots of people in this institution are racist, which is not actually.
Yes.
Which is not exactly.
This is the shit we're saying.
Yeah. This is actually a point that I make in my new video that I'm working on. It's the idea that institutional racism means bad people in institutions rather than actual historical material forces that kind of push people away from access and all of those different things. It's individualized.
The thing about institutional racism is that you can be a really nice person. And that's the thing about capitalism that people don't understand. When we transform this all into melodrama, you can be a really nice person. You can give to charity, but the logic of the system pushes your hand. That's the important thing to understand. And it is very scary when we personalize politics like that, because then it becomes just about those bad people doing bad things. And then it's just, evil people versus good people. And then you're into fascist territory. You start reproducing the very stuff that you're supposed to be You're supposed to be criticizing. But what I was saying is that the main...
Welcome to twitter.com.
Yes. But their main claim is that the problem is you, and it's in your head, and it's between your ears, and therefore I can fix that. And of course they can't. And that's the thing too, is that we overstate the efficacy of a lot of these fads, these sort of faddish therapeutic interventions. They claim that they can fix that problem in your head, but they can't. They don't, because the problem isn't in people's heads. The problem is structural. The problem is institutional. The problem is often economic. The problem is often capitalism. And they can't solve that by changing people's subjectivity. And so what winds up happening is after we start to realize that these fads don't make good on their promises, it's too late, because what creates a fad isn't how good it is and how efficacious it is. So people will criticize a fad the whole time, and then it starts to fade because it's just not new anymore. And there's something else will come up. And then people are criticizing the old fad, often because they are proponents of the new fad. And we never stop to say, hey, look, that didn't work. Maybe we shouldn't do that again. We don't. Exactly. Instead, it's no, that didn't work. This new thing that I'm promising for the low price, no, that's the thing that's going to work.
Tell your friends.
Exactly.
If you have them. Yeah,
I really do. Yeah, resonate with the point that you said about the fact that it oftentimes these professional kind of solutions fill the void of old traditional bonds. And I worry that the more and more our bonds get eroded, the more and more this problem is going to deepen. I mean, obviously, like the atomization that the COVID situation has caused has really eroded a lot of basic things, like all of the things we take for granted, like something as simple as going to the cinema and bumping into someone, or being at a restaurant with friends and like making friends with the next table of people next to you, or any of the silly things that we do and take for granted that give us the opportunity to kind of interact with people. Because obviously we're weird. We usually need excuses to talk to each other, which is why we invent culture in the first place, so that we can have a reason to be around other people and to kind of experience that kind of transpersonal experience. And now that the domain of the transpersonal has become way more personalized, I mean, even down to entertainment, like, people are kind of going on about the death of cinema and how everything's going to move to streaming, and it's going to be this like very kind of personalized thing. I feel like the pervasiveness of this therapy culture also kind of follows that same trend of like personalized and individualistic kind of way of dealing with issues, or finding resonance, or having some kind of transcendent experience in that regard. What do you think about this sort of atomization? Where do you see it leading to in future in lots of different domains?
I think generally when it comes to social problems, I'm very disturbed by the way that therapeutic culture or therapy culture individualizes social problems and seeks to solve them within the mind of the individual. Because, as I said, it can't possibly solve those problems. But instead of understanding that we've misunderstood the problem, it's not just a failure of individual subjectivity or greed or whatever, we just become more and more pessimistic. We think, oh, well, the human being is just so degraded, is just so sick and so weak, that we become very, very misanthropic and very anti-human. And I think that's what happens if you look at, like, for example, climate change. People are sitting there going, come on, like, don't you see? How could you be so stupid? Don't do this. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. And people are like, yeah, I know, right? But what they're misunderstanding, or what some people misunderstand, not everybody, is that climate change is not about our individual behaviors. Again, it's the system that pushes your hand.
What are you talking about?
But instead of, and that's like a very basic point, right? But instead of understanding that, people just become more and more misanthropic. And you get people saying like, well, human beings are just a plague on the planet. And, I told you so many times, but you will not listen.
Humans are the virus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or just a general contempt I've noticed as well for like the poor and the working class in that regard. It's like you see these sort of nice liberals making sort of these weird like what's the name of the philosopher again? What's his name? I forget. What's wrong with me? I can't think. But they're basically making these weird like useless eater kind of arguments about the poor and working class. And they see that as being justified because they're not doing the moral thing, or they're not consuming ethically enough, or they're not being mindful in terms of their choices underneath the system.
Or they're quote unquote voting against their own interests.
Yeah, voting against their own interests. And, you know, like I even saw, it was a blue check mark person on, I forget, some blue check mark lib journalist who was like, they basically put up the statistics of like, people who are the disparity in voting between people who are quote unquote educated and then people who are not educated, quote unquote. And they obviously saw like a high amount of quote unquote the uneducated who voted for Trump, or who were planning on voting for Trump in the next election. And then the educated, quote unquote, was Biden voters. And they were basically like, see, you know, it's only dumb people make those kinds of decisions. And they specifically talked about the regions of the country. So it's like, look, it's the coastal kind of civilized parts of America, not flyover country in the center. And there's this sort of weird anti-poor, anti-working class, like Malthusian. That was the word I was looking for.
Yes.
It's like a Malthusian kind of doctrine that you see, and especially within things like Extinction Rebellion as well. I know that they've come out, you know, recently and stated that they're kind of anti-Marxist in that regard. And, you know, there's the joke that's going around that, like, you know, environmentalism without material analysis is just kind of like posh gardening, really. It's not really something that is viable or that has legs. But there's this, that you see some of that sentiment within their quote unquote activism, the idea that like we are the problem, and and you know, any sort of push for anything systemic is met with very deep suspicion, almost the same kind of suspicion that you see them view people from the far right with, whenever the people from the broader left sort of speak about these issues or talk about class-centered politics.
I pissed off vegans again today.
No, God, what
happened there?
I posted about how, you know, 70%, according to Yale, 70% of people in the United States believe in climate change. Like, they ran polling on it. And obviously there's that statistic that 71% of the emissions in the world are more or less put out by 100 corporations. And I basically said, I've said this point a million times and it pisses them off every time, but like, what you eat doesn't actually have a bearing on that. Like, that's the primary mover of climate change, and it's entirely within the hands of people who own capital and can make those decisions. Like, you can't make those decisions by buying better food.
Again, this is the problem when movements have lost the radical economic critique, because they just imbibe the bourgeois critique, quote unquote critique, which is to criticize consumers. So like the bourgeois economics has shifted everything onto the demand side, right? And we've lost the whole understanding of the supply side and production and so on.
Well, supply, it proportionately equals demand. Like, it just follows demand around all day long.
But this is why it is so frustrating that I think that everything stands or falls really on our understanding of economics and whether or not that economic critique of capitalism is correct, because you're right, it doesn't matter what you eat and so on, because demand has to be created. Well, why does demand have to be created? Because of capitalist competition. You have to produce more and more quickly than your competitors, and you do that in whatever way possible. If it means, like, you know, you have to go and shoot a whole bunch of striking workers, you'll do it, because even if you're a nice person, well, in fact, they will not themselves pick up the gun. They will be through several different channels, right? Good people probably wouldn't pick up the gun, but or like at least not that desperate people. But that's the thing, is that the logic of the system pushes you to do that because of competition. You have to do it, or you have to go be a worker yourself, and you have to produce a lot. Now, that's wonderful. That's a really good thing. Producing lots and lots of stuff is great if we had a direct relationship with production and our goals in society. Like, if that was our goal, that we wanted to live within like to prosper and so on within nature, with like ensuring that we have enough to continue for hundreds of years or thousands of years or whatever, we could do that as human beings. We're capable of doing that, but we don't live in direct relationship. We don't produce in direct relationship with our ends. We produce indirectly through the medium of profit. And so people failing to understand that see it all as human error. And that is really, and that's the thing, that's a wonderful thing about Marxism, just a little plug, is that it doesn't come down to human error. You know, that's why it's shored up against Malthusianism, and why, in fact, Marx, you can go through his work and hit Control F on Marxist.org and look for Malthus. You will find that he never mentions Malthus's name without insulting him in some way.
Yeah, Marx and Engels were kind of the original chud dunkers.
And why did he hate Malthus so much? Because Marx was a humanist through and through. He understood that it was through our rational behaviors, acting perfectly rationally within capitalism, that produces these aggregate effects, these effects at the aggregate level that appear to be entirely irrational. He calls it the anarchy of production. But that is through being doing what seems best, right? And it's not down to individuals. When you lose that, it is very easy to become misanthropic, because it's just individuals making mistakes. And when the problems persist because you've not understood them, you become more and more pessimistic, more and more misanthropic.
That's kind of the affects that I'm noticing sort of arising among, like, you know, the quote unquote normie kind of pop cultural youth culture kind of thing. It's kind of the meme of like the doomer, which is this very sort of Malthusian anti-human atomized subject, and it's almost like a mimetic hazard, like a mimetic virus that sort of pervaded its way across pop culture and internet culture and youth culture, and it's quite fashionable now to be a doomer and to sort of see the problems in front of us as unfixable, and to sort of, you know, see them as a result of some fundamental flaw within our nature. So what would you say to all of the doomers out there? How do you think is the best way to sort of combat this mimetic hazard?
Well, I would say that I always think that the most important thing for me is to understand that human subjectivity is open. An open subject means that means an open future. It means that the future is an open subject. That what it means to be human is not determined. And if you look throughout human history and across the world, you see myriad ways of living and organizing society. So if human society was the result of human nature, you would see far less variability. But if human society is part of a dialectic with our human nature, that is what makes us, what is our nature, is that we create our own nature, that we recreate it. Obviously, there are certain things that will be, you know, reproduced again and again. We all have to eat and so on. But how we go about meeting those needs is different, and it makes us different. And there is like something of a discussion between, a critical discussion between anthropology and psychology, but psychology has become extremely hegemonic in the culture. And we're like all this stuff about like child rearing and so on. Oh, it all has to be done this particular way, which is all based on white middle class mothers in the West. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you go to other countries, you find that actually people raise their children in so many different ways you cannot possibly imagine. Mm-hmm. Like so many, I could give you some examples that you'd have to censor how people raise children, and yet they grow up to become more or less contributing members of their society in the same way that we grow up to become more or less contributing members of our society. So I would say the most important thing is to have, I feel like the loss of that open and indeterminate subject is an incredible loss, and it's very difficult to overstate that. I don't expect that I will be able to win that argument, but I think that history will prove that that's correct, and history and anthropology proves that that's correct, that what it means to be human is incredibly variable.
So true. Thank you so much for coming on No Society and giving us these insights. You've given me quite a bit to chew on, especially as somebody who is very kind of interested in psychology, but also critical of how it's kind of become this hegemonic force in the culture. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't want to like be like, I'm not anti-psychology.
No, yeah, I
think there's a lot of good stuff in there. I'm just saying like the ethnocentric kind of like cultural understanding of psychology. That's what I'm taking issue with.
It's definitely an issue that I've noticed. Like I did a video a while back on capitalism and spirituality culture and how, you know, those trends have like, you know, become somewhat hegemonic within wellness culture. So yeah, definitely. This is a critique that I feel people need to hear. And especially because it's usually centered around wellness culture in the abstract rather than around therapy culture, like as a kind of hegemonic force. So yeah, definitely. Thank you for your insights. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the listeners too. Be sure to do all of the things that help out the podcast. Support us on Patreon. Check out our Reddit. Defend us from being cancelled on our Reddit, because that happens quite frequently. Thank you guys for listening, and we shall catch you later. Goodbye.
Bye.